Hi, everyone. This is the podcast Storytelling Deconstructed. I'm Erik Linnell. This is my friend Cody Zervos.
This is the podcast where we analyze stories, break them down, and discuss why they work, and when they don't work, we discuss that too, and we try to rewrite them in an attempt to create a comprehensive manual of sorts for storytelling.
Stay tuned, we got more.
I want to frame everything we talk about because storytelling is part of the reason I wanted to do a podcast on storytelling was it's so fascinatingly deep and complex. It's this is a cliche that people say about a lot of things, that the cliche of you can spend your life learning about it and never master it. Okay, that's all well and good. I don't give a fuck about chess or whatever. Storytelling that's definitely true about storytelling. But what's interesting about storytelling is there's no right answers. It's an art. And as with all arts, it's not a science, it's not math. There's no definitive black and white right or wrong. And so it's extremely difficult to say this is a winning move or this is not a winning move. And as a result, there's infinite lenses through which you can analyze and understand stories. And so I feel like a large part of gaining a mastery over storytelling, either just as a consumer of it or as a writer yourself, is not necessarily learning what the right moves are or what the right answers are. It is collecting a bin or a toolbox of lenses through which you can view your story, and devices through which you can analyze what's happening, etc. And so whatever situation you're faced with, again, both either in a story that you're consuming or that you're trying to write, you will potentially, the more lenses you have, the higher the chance will be that you have one that will be helpful in this situation. So I almost think of it, it's like a tool bag. It's like you're in a situation, you're trying to write this scene or you're trying to write this story and you're stuck and you open up your tool bag and you go, well, maybe it'll help if I view it through this lens. And you put those glasses on and it goes, oh, that's not helpful. And you put another pair of glasses on, and finally you find like, oh, looking at it in this way, analyzing it through this lens, it helped me reframe the way I was thinking about it. It gave me new ideas for what could come next, how to conceptualize it, and that allowed me to reach breakthroughs that are satisfying and emotionally moving, and ultimately expedited the process. It's faster than it would have gone just through trial and error. And so I feel like that's a large part of what we're going to be trying to do here in this podcast, right? Is collect and archive these different lenses, none of which is comprehensive, none of which is the ultimate one-size-fits-all solution that can be applied in every instance and you'll never need another one. They are just tools.
Right. So, because all you have going into a story is a click. You have like a click in your brain that lets you know this is right and this is wrong. And you don't know the nature of that click. And I know it sounds really like superstitious and spiritual, mumbo jumbo, a bunch of nonsense. But I think that the reaction that fans have had to this ending of Game of Thrones is proof that everyone has some sense of what that click is, whether it's loud or soft. And so if you know these tools, it's just a way of self-analysis. Why certain stories move you, why certain stories don't, and if a story that you like goes a bad way, why did it do that?
That's exactly right. It's descriptive, not prescriptive.
Yes.
You're trying to understand why you like stories so that you can recreate that. This should not be the reason that you like a story or don't like it.
Absolutely.
All art, and especially storytelling in particular, is horrendously rife with mystification and, for lack of a better word, utter and complete spiritual bullshit. So if you listen to the way artists and writers especially talk about their process, it's maddening. It's always, oh, I just pick up my pen and the light of God flows through me and words come out and I don't know where it comes from. It's just magic. This is something that Erik and I have talked about at length over the years that drives us fucking insane. Because that's all bullshit, of course. I mean, it might be true that they don't understand their own process, but that's a hindrance. That's a handicap. That's not a... They speak about it like it's, they're like proud of that fact. And I think that a lot of the time it's true that they really don't know what's happening, but I think some of the time it's that they're intentionally mystifying the process because there's a little bit of that, guarding the
they don't want competition.
Yeah.
And they're afraid if they give away their secrets, then it's like, oh, then you'll get my next job.
Right. So anyway, so a big explicit goal of this podcast is to demystify storytelling and to try to talk about it in extremely plain language and to break it down into chunks that your left brain can work on, not just your right brain. Like, we don't want to unweave the rainbow. We don't want to suck the magic out of it. That's the art half of storytelling to me. It's like, what are the parts that are magical and wondrous that come out of your deep recesses of your right brain when you're in that place halfway between awake and asleep. But then there's also the left brain craft. And so you can't really speak to the art side, but this podcast is going to try to demystify as much as possible the craft side, the part that you have to think about explicitly, logically, sequentially.
In this first episode, we're going to discuss the ending of Game of Thrones. So we're not only going to talk about the finale, we're going to talk about pretty much most of the last season, and then things in the show in general that we thought worked, and things that you could have used from those earlier seasons to make the last few seasons better. So
yeah, I think Erik and I are both in agreement that George R. R. Martin is one of the most exquisite storytellers we've ever encountered. I meant to say.
Especially in modern times, in particular.
And so, for a long time, I think we both feel that was reflected in Game of Thrones. For the first 4 to 5 seasons, the storytelling was pretty immaculate and was an exemplar of a lot of what you're supposed to do. And then I think that we're both of the opinion that in recent seasons, and especially the last season to 2, it really went off the rails, due, no doubt, to the fact that it ran out of book source material. And so, as Erik said, we're going to be spending today's episode on trying to figure out what exactly George did so brilliantly in the books, which was reflected in the show, and then figure out where it went wrong and how in the later seasons.
Because a lot of fans were really unsatisfied with the way that the show came to a close. And let me also be clear, I'm not one of those people who thinks that if you didn't like the ending that, oh, it's just a TV show, don't make it a big deal. Obviously, both Cody and I think that storytelling is one of the most important things in life. And if you send people away from a story unsatisfying, it messes them up spiritually. So we're going to take this very seriously and try to have a really meaningful conversation about what is wrong with it and how they could fix it.
A large part of our friendship has been devoted to, and in aggregate, we've probably spent thousands of hours discussing and trying to understand storytelling together. And so that's what we're going to do now.
So we're going to dive in, and in our diving in, we're going to start with some of the things that we think George does really well, because then that will set up a good way of contrasting it with what the writers of the show have done in this last part of the show since they got past the books. So one of the things that George is great at, I think, is getting interesting characters in the same room, because all the characters he makes are interesting by themselves. We'll talk about what we think makes a good character in a little bit, but we just want to start with the kernel of a scene. And Cody, you'll probably agree with me on this. I think the kernel of a great scene is just having two characters that you didn't even know you wanted together in the same room, having some sort of conversation.
Yes, I totally agree with that. I feel like a lot of the time, one of the most elementary but most effective ways to get your story rolling is to just ask yourself, how can I get these interesting characters into the same room? And if you've done your work before that, by that I mean if you've created interesting, deep characters who have motives and history, then once they're in the same room together, and again, this is a bit of a cliche that I hate to use, but it will kind of write itself. I think that's true a lot of the time in my experience. And I feel like you see this all the time in sitcoms, especially, where a lot of times the premise for a whole episode will be, hey, let's take these two characters who rarely interact and put them together. And a lot of times you'll also see this coincide with a bottle episode. For those of you who aren't familiar, a bottle episode is an episode that where the whole episode, or at least one whole plot line, takes place in one location, and it's just done to save money on sets. And so, like, the classic sort of archetypal example is the episode where the characters get trapped in the elevator together because the elevator breaks down. And so the whole episode is them just sitting in an elevator, lamenting and bonding, and there's, and so if you take the two characters who have a weird history together but don't often interact, and then they get trapped in an elevator together, there's an episode. A specific example is, on the top of my head, is the episode where Robin, from How I Met Your Mother, where Robin and Marshall hang out. They don't get trapped in an elevator, but the whole premise of their whole plotline in that episode is, hey, these are two characters who hang out in the context of the group all the time, but we never really see them alone together. What would that look like? And then there you go. There's an episode, and it starts to it kind of goes, like, there's so much there, dramatically speaking, that they have all this baggage as characters, but they haven't specifically related it to each other yet. That you don't have to do a lot of work of inventing what's going to happen. It's like if they just say the things that we think they're going to say, it's still probably pretty satisfying just because we've never seen them say those things before.
An example that comes immediately to mind is in season 2, the sudden meeting between Tywin Lannister and Arya Stark. When you first set out on watching this show, there are many characters whose worlds you would never expect to come together. And I think those two are a great example of making... It essentially gives you something that you didn't know that you wanted. The meeting of Tywin Lannister and Arya Stark. Just saying Tywin Lannister and Arya Stark in the same room, that is innately dramatic, especially after the war starts, because now they're openly enemies, and if Tywin knew that Arya Stark was Arya Stark, she would be disposed with immediately. So those two characters have enough just dramatic juice that they could just stand in the same room as each other, and it would be innately interesting. And that's only just to talk about that nugget. The way it's played out is even more interesting because Tywin does not know her identity, and it's always on the precipice of Tywin suddenly figuring out who he's kept as his cupbearer. And as soon as he figures that out, it's over. Arya has to play a game to keep her identity safe from Tywin. And George, using his excellent dramatic skills, pushes that to its limit when all of a sudden Littlefinger, who knows Arya Stark's identity, has a meeting with Tywin. And so then that third weave intersects with this already interesting story of Tywin Lannister and Arya Stark, and that in itself makes sense because Littlefinger was sent to give Ned Stark's bones to Catelyn Stark, and then it just so happens that he's on his way back from King's Landing, and he makes a stop at Harrenhal, and that meeting will then be the origin of bringing the Tyrells into the fold of the War of the Five Kings and bringing them in on the Lannister side. And so even if you don't understand a word that I just said, you can see the craft that's involved with taking these various threads and intersecting them in ways that are immensely fascinating and meaningful to watch. But then it's not only about the moment, and he nails that moment where it's Littlefinger, Tywin Lannister, and Arya Stark in the same room, but then it makes sense in terms of the longer arc of their stories that they're in the same room at the same time. If Littlefinger had not come at that time, then the Tyrells would not have been able to save King's Landing from being sacked by Stannis. And so all of that is embedded into that one scene. Putting interesting characters in a room together, and maybe if that room could have some kind of significance, in the same way that Harrenhal did to the Tywin Arya Littlefinger scene, that is the foundation upon which all scenes come to life. And the more you can make that kernel compelling, then you can only go up from there, unless you completely ruin it. And there are times when people can completely ruin it. So contrasting the Arya Littlefinger Tywin Lannister scene with, say, the second episode of this most recent season, where the writers framed it as, what's the last night alive that the people fighting the dead are going to have with each other? And so each of them have their own desires. They want to do something on this night. They want to have they want to be relieved of some sort of psychological burden that they've had on their minds. How do we satisfy that in the course of an episode? And in my opinion, the writers David and DB, they did not do a good job of doing this. And as a sort of focal point of all this, I would take the scene near the end where Jaime Lannister knights Brienne. It felt very much like it just happened, and that because there's been this whole thing throughout the show where, because Brienne is a woman, she can't be knighted, but she's better than all of her peers. And so the way the writers, I imagine, decide to do this is, well, it's the last night, and norms, who gives a damn about those anymore? So Jaime Lannister, who's a member of the Kingsguard, can knight Brienne. Now, that premise, there's really nothing wrong with it on the face of it. But the execution made it seem like it just sort of came out of nowhere and happened just because of necessities of the writing.
So how could that have been executed better?
One way that things like that can be executed better is knowing when the right time is to do them. Something I've realized is there's a real downside to pure suspense, which is withholding certain things that the audience wants for long periods of time just to keep them in perpetual yearning. And one of the downsides is that if people don't get what they want after a while, they just stop wanting it. And so for that specific thing, they waited so long that I totally forgot that was even a thing that I would have desired to have. And then it just...
That's a good point.
The execution of it really just came out of nowhere, where they're having a conversation about knights, and then really out of the blue, it just seems like Jaime's like, oh yeah, I can totally knight you right now.
Yeah, had it happened the exact same way, more or less, but just a few seasons earlier, like after they had bonded and things and stuff, it probably would have felt a little bit better. Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And there were a lot of things in that particular episode that felt that way. Because what the writers were trying to do was close as many brackets as they could. Because when you reach the end of a story, you ideally want to leave as few plot threads hanging as possible. So, for instance, to use an example from another fantasy series, J.K. Rowling does this all the time in Harry Potter. Well, she'll set up a bunch of plot threads, and then each book will close all those plot threads. I like to think of them as parentheses, which is because when you're coding something on a computer, you need to make sure all the parentheses are closed, otherwise it'll throw off the whole formula. So like at the end of Sorcerer's Stone, after the Sorcerer's Stone plot thread is closed, the story is not over. It continues on because we have to see who wins the House Cup. We have to see what Harry's situation is going to be like when he goes back home to the Dursleys. I think that's their name. And so closing those plot threads is what gives the feeling of satisfaction at the end of a story. And if you wait too long, or you just put a string of those parentheses closing in one episode without any direct connection to past plot threads, and it's just a bunch of people sitting around in a room, and then it's like, oh, guess we got to close this plot thread, then that's less good. That's not as good of writing, in my opinion.
Right. Because you start to feel like you're seeing the writing. That's always something that you want to avoid, right? It's like you want to avoid that sensation that it feels written.
Yeah.
And it's like it feels in that instance like, oh, the writers are just trying to close threads.
Exactly.
It's like this is not the natural place for this to happen.
Exactly.
And so it's just purely the proximity of them all together is part of also what makes it feel bad. Just that there's so many happening all of a sudden. It's like really, it strains credulity a little bit. Really, all these things happen to be really being resolved all at once on one night. I can buy a few, but come on.
If we were to extract a general principle out of that, you never ever want your reader, viewer, whichever medium you're telling the story in, you never want them to feel as if you did something purely because it would be convenient for the plot or the characters. So
right.
You can have that happen in a Deus Ex Machina, which is where some force saves the main character from having to solve the problem themselves. Or it can happen in the case of extreme inconvenience to the character, where it's unbelievably inconvenient. In general, you can get away with more often inconveniences to the main character rather than conveniences, because people will just buy that random bad stuff will happen rather than random good stuff. But to sort of jump around this last season of Game of Thrones, and this is not my observation, many people have made this observation before, but when Daenerys' second dragon gets killed by the Iron Fleet, and then after the episode, David Benioff essentially said, well, Daenerys was busy fighting the Night King, and they totally forgot about the Southern enemy, but the Southern enemy didn't forget about them, so haha, now one of her other dragons is dead. That felt inconvenient for her in a way that was extraordinarily unbelievable.
Yes. Like, in general, like, I feel like this is sort of a smaller principle, but a principle nonetheless. I don't know if we've ever talked about this, but in general, like, the fine grain of life should be left out of storytelling. The small foibles and human imperfections. Storytelling is the world of grandeur. Even if you're trying to write a story, a little indie film about a small town, 2 characters, 3 sets, like even if you're trying to write a small film, it's still grand on some level, on an emotional level, just by the nature of the fact that you're telling a story about it. So you might be elevating small things to a grand level, but storytelling is still by necessity on some level about grandeur. And so you kind of like want to avoid, like, it's this rule that is the reason that we never see characters go to the bathroom. Right? It's like, are they pooping? Yeah, probably. Why don't we see it? It's like, well, because we don't need to see every little foible and detail, and it's not important. This is the difference between life and storytelling. Life has all of the extraneous, boring detail included. In storytelling, you omit it. Anyway, the reason this is relevant to what you were just saying is the whole thing, the entire thing, that all of that hinges on was Danny forgetting. Really? Well, not just Danny, of course. Her and all of her advisors and everybody that she's associated with. But like, what a small, stupid thing to hinge at. Like what a boring little flaw, foible, mistake. That it's just, oh, they just goofed. They just made a little goof. They just forgot. Like, that's so unsatisfying. Like, you want, when things happen, especially big things like that, you want them to be because of a big central flaw that is important to the character or the decisions they've made. One way that I like to articulate this is characters should believe in their flaws. So, let me say it this way. There's sort of tiers to the quality of plot points like this. The highest tier, and you can tell me if you agree with this, Erik, is when characters make decisions aware of the fact that it might be a mistake, but making it anyway because of a belief they hold deeply. In other words, if it is a flaw, they believe in that. It's some fundamental philosophy that they hold, and they're willing to take the bad with the good.
Or at very least, it should be something that has been consistent across their entire characters.
So an example of the first one would be like Ned Stark believing in being honest and forthcoming and honorable, right? Every decision he made in the first season that led to him being killed, he knew that there was a risk in what he was doing, but he did it anyway because he's an honest, honorable man, and that's the way he believes in living his life, and he's willing to accept what comes with that. And so all of that led to his demise. Tier number 2 is when a character has a flaw that is deep and integral to who they are. They don't necessarily believe in it, but it's still an integral part of who they are. So a broad example of this is like the character who, was hurt by love in the past and has trouble loving again. Right? So maybe they want to love again. So that's that they don't necessarily believe in not being able to trust people, but it's still an emotional hurdle that they have trouble overcoming. And so they make decisions based on that. But it's deeply in them. And then of course the lowest tier that should be avoided at all costs is this one, where it's they don't believe in it, it's not a philosophy that they hold, and it's not some deep character trait. It's just they blundered. They just made a mistake. They just forgot something. They tripped over a rock, and so that cascaded the entire plot in a different direction. Had they not tripped over the rock, it's like, that's so what? It just happenstance at that point. It's just, the molecules happen to drift in this direction instead of this direction.
Right, and to tie this sort of all together, those 3 tiers are each, as you go down the 3 tiers, like, you want to avoid the stuff at the bottom more. But that's not to say that you can't use them ever, because like we said, these aren't strict rules. These are just general guidelines. But say, for instance, the theme of your piece of work is life can be altered incredibly by random happenstance, and you establish that as a recurring motif throughout the story, then you could arguably get away with that. And then to use... Right.
And by the way, right now, yes, totally. That's by the way. Sorry, I know what I'm But by the way, I would call that the principle by which you break principles. I'm so glad you said this, because this is... I wasn't thinking we were going to get into this in this episode. But I think in general, the way, if you were going to violate like principles of writing, I don't know if we've ever talked about this. I think the way that you have to do it, and you're kind of talking about it right now, is you have to make that the point of the story that you're telling. Like, you have to call attention to it. You have to say, on some level, I'm doing something aberrant here. I'm violating a principle, and look how that's the point of the story I'm telling. Isn't that crazy, or whatever?
Yeah, exactly. So for instance, to go back to Cody's tier 2, if you want your character to just be, whoops, I forgot, then you should make them more like Dory in Finding Nemo.
Right. Great example.
Because she has short-term memory loss. That's an integral part of her character.
So you've made a tier 3 into a tier 2.
And the same can be true for going to the bathroom. So for instance, the example that comes to mind is LBJ. because in almost every movie I've seen about him, there's a scene of him, he's taking a dump, and he calls someone over to have an important policy conversation over, and that's just a part of who he is as a person, which is like, I don't give a shit if I'm fucking my uncle while I'm talking to you. We're going to have a really important conversation right now, even though this thing that most people get uncomfortable or other people would find embarrassing, we're going to do that right now. And then that gives you insight into who that person is. Whereas if you just show them going to the bathroom and then flushing and then like nothing ever comes of it, why did you just show this to us?
Erik, I love that you had an example off the top of your head of how pooping can be used in this way. When I initially suggested that, I had no examples for it in my head. So this is why one thing I love about the way your brain works is that you have this encyclopedic knowledge of basically everything, as far as I can tell. Everything art related at the very least.
Well, at some point in my life, the bathroom beat is going to be the pivotal moment in a story, and I'm going to thank myself. And the audience is it's going to be the most moving dump of everyone's life who experiences it.
I always have like this recurring thing in my head. I don't know, where like I always imagine like at some point like the devil himself will arise from the earth and pull me down to the underworld and involve me in some kind of like elaborate demonic game show in which I have to do a task or something, and the stakes of either the world or my own life or the lives of my loved ones are on the line. And it will always depend on something stupid like that, like being able to remember some obscure fact or something stupid like that. And like if I can get it right, I save everything. And that's basically what that was.
And when you get the poop fact right, you're going to point up, but you're not going to be pointing up to God. You're going to be pointing up to me. That's what you're going to do. I only work through his ways. I am a mere vessel of his holy word.
That's right. So that's part of Erik's genius, is that he always has the perfect example for any whatever you're talking about.
This shall be tested to its limit through the point of this podcast. So we got into character a little bit earlier than I thought we were going to, but like, yeah, essentially with individual characters, you need there to be very little friction between their beliefs and the way that they act, and if there is a dissonance, you need to make that dissonance still incorporated within their worldview. So for instance, it's like one of the reasons why the show can get away with having really complex characters who both have great love and great hatred inside of them is that it makes sense who they love. They love their children, they love their family, they love the people in their castle, and then everyone else is essentially barbarians, and they act that out. So even though there's a contradiction between the fact that they have intense love for some people and intense hatred for others, it still makes sense within the framework of their being.
Right.
Because, I mean, obviously, this might confuse a lot of people, because obviously real people are extraordinarily complex and they do not behave this way. But the thing about stories is they are a purely human, it's a medium that is purely in existence to satisfy human psychology. And
great point.
And human psychology is of the point where like things do need to make sense in that way, otherwise it's not satisfying. So even if it's quote unquote realistic, it will have no emotional impact, and that's the whole point of the story. So when Daenerys just, whoops, I forgot that the Iron Fleet was there and that they have harpoons, that's useless. Like, not that might be a thing that quote could actually happen, but it's just completely unsatisfying.
Right, absolutely, yeah. And again, it's like insofar as you want to violate that, because I'm sure, like I feel like this a lot. It's like I'm sure like you always have that feeling when you hear about that sort of thing, or when you think about that, or where it's like, okay, well, yeah, but I want to do things different, and the way I'll carve out my niche as a writer is I'll be the one who's daring enough to break the mold, and I'll write stories about the the unmentionable things about the real way that the universe works, and I'll achieve a verisimilitude that is unprecedented in writing, and that'll be my breakthrough. And I think that's all well and good, but again, it's like you have to make it the point. Insofar as you violate these principles of quote unquote good storytelling, or again, it's like they're really just principles of satisfying human psychology. Like, you just have to make it the point. So like, if your story is about the chaos of the cosmos and how nothing makes sense and everything is unsatisfying, that has to be the point of the story.
Yeah, you just have to lean into it.
Yes.
You can't. And here's another general principle. I know that our conversations tend to be very scattershot, so there's not going to be any difference here. So then, just to bring up another example of this sort of writing where the flaws betray previously established character, I want to go back now to season 7, which, if there's a theme to season 7, it's obviously Cersei and Daenerys are fighting for the Iron Throne, but there's an even bigger threat up north that needs to be taken care of. Otherwise, this whole Game of Thrones battle doesn't matter at all. So if you had to extract the theme from season 7, I think that would be it. And one of the things that season 7 did quite poorly is they would betray characters' established personalities, established traits, purely so that way the plot could be a little more interesting. And the result of it was that the plot was made less interesting, so it was detrimental to their purpose. And the example I want to bring up is Tyrion's seeming decrease in IQ that happened during that season. Because here's the problem that the writers were facing, ostensibly. Daenerys and Cersei are fighting for the Iron Throne. Cersei is at a big disadvantage. She has no allies. Everyone hates her by now. The only people she really has on her side is the Iron Fleet. Whereas Daenerys has a lot of the big families on her side, a lot of the smartest people on her side. She has 3 dragons on top of all this and a huge army. So the problem that we're facing is, well, it seems like Daenerys is just going to win easy because she has so many advantages on her side. So how do we make it so that way it's not that easy? And the route that they chose to take is they made Tyrion make a lot of mistakes in strategy. Tyrion was the chief architect of the battle strategy for Daenerys in season 7, and they just kept going wrong. There was the time when he had Grey Worm go attack Casterly Rock, when really the Lannisters were going to attack Highgarden and steal all the resources for themselves, because that's where all the resources are. And that was so unsatisfying because Tyrion has been framed in this entire story as a genius. He basically saved King's Landing from utter destruction in a very similar situation back in season 2. And so it doesn't make sense now to him all of a sudden be making these silly mistakes. And it was just purely so that way it could be a fair fight. And so if I were to extract a general principle out of this Tyrion blunder and this Daenerys blunder where one of her dragons was shot down due to being hurt forgetting, do not betray the promise of your characters. Do not betray the promise of your show. If your show is about using cunning and dishonorable tactics in order to achieve power, then don't all of a sudden take a turn that doesn't make sense like one of those two, just so that way you can have a fair fight. Tyrion is supposed to be a genius. Unless he suffered brain damage, you should betray that promise.
Yeah, I think this is a good example of how, like, there's this weird thing where it almost feels like as you progress and get better as a writer, it feels like the principles of writing almost flip. Do you know what I mean? Like the because everybody is aware to some degree of some of these sort of principles that theoretically guide a good story. For example, one of the simplest being like that it ought to be dramatic and interesting. And we all kind of have a sense of, what makes good dramatic structure and such. At the very least, just because we've all been exposed to so much dramatic structure. And so, you start off as a writer and you go, well, following dramatic structure makes things dramatic, right? And then as you progress as a writer, you start to realize, well, actually, people are so familiar with that structure that adhering to it actually saps drama from your story because it's so predictable. And so it's through subverting it that you can gain back some of that drama. That's just an example of how it sort of inverts, right? It's almost like what you think is correct almost completely gets flipped on its head as you become better and subtle and more subtle with your execution and your understanding. And I feel like this is sort of an example of that, where the writers understood on some level that for it to be dramatic and interesting, as you said, it needed to be a more or less fair fight. If one side seemed extremely overpowered, the outcome would be too predictable, etc. And so that would be the sort of a novice analysis of the situation, or, for lack of a better, maybe not novice, because they're not novices, but they're not as good as storytellers as George, clearly. And so a deeper, George's understanding would be almost a flip of that in fact, if you try to serve your instincts in that way, you're actually going to suck, you're going to suck drama and intrigue and interest out of your story.
Yes. And so this brings me to what was the biggest disappointment for a lot of fans in season 8 of Game of Thrones, which was Daenerys' turn to being mad. And this goes back to that principle of betraying your character. It wasn't the fact that she went mad, I don't think, that was the problem, because they had followed George's blueprint, setting up this idea that because of the incestuous nature of the Targaryens, every time a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin about whether or not they're sane or insane. So that was set up. And then also it was clear throughout the seasons that Daenerys enjoyed watching people burn. We didn't mind because a lot of the people that she enjoyed burning were outrageously bad people. So we went along with that, and we took her cruelty as part of her strength. And she was using the cruelty as a way to free slave subjects from their masters. So illustrates a good way of using complexity to your advantage. Because George set up this thing, it's like, oh, she's extraordinarily cruel to those who do not obey her will, or those who enslave others and engage in gratuitous cruelty, but she still has that compassion for the dispossessed. But with this turn in season 8, that principle of having empathy for the dispossessed just went away completely. Because not only did she not just fly to the Red Keep in a straight line to get Cersei, And not only did the dragon firebomb all the people below that were in that line, they made a point of saying she had literally no reason to do it because the bells rang, as Tyrion said, if the bells ring, they surrender. And she was weaving. She was weaving. She was weaving when she was killing the innocent people. And the only thing that the writers could point to in justifying this sudden change was the fact that she burned Lord Tarly and his son in season 7 when they defied her. But even then, that still fit within the framework of her previously established character, which is that she does not like defiance. She does not like open defiance. Whereas in season 8, the innocent people in the city did not openly defy her. In fact, they made a point of saying they were going to give her the city without violence. They rang the bells. And she did it anyways, just so that way they could have a twist. It betrayed a core element of her character. And I think that's why a lot of viewers feel very betrayed by that course of action in the show.
And to fix that and make it work, at least just this one little element. And that is, I think you could have, and this would have been, in my opinion, a pretty elegant way of doing it. You could have brought together these two sides of her. The one side being, as you outlined, Erik, her cruelty in service of her, fulfilling what she sees as her destiny, and that means, destroying those who oppose her. And on the other hand, her view of herself as this liberator, benevolent ruler, etc. And all you need to do, is make the former bleed into the latter, and the lines between them blur. So here's what, for example, I think that this was probably their intention, maybe, I'm assuming, but I think the execution was just very not there. Give her a reason to see the people as complicit in some way. To see the citizens of King's Landing in some way complicit with Cersei, in some way in defiance or opposition against her. And it can still be satisfying from the perspective of her descent into madness, or her descent into cruelty at the very least, into psychopathy or whatever, because you can make this the most gray, morally gray, and just unclear situation that she's faced yet. Each time she's faced it, it's been a little bit more morally ambiguous. It's been a little bit less clear, right? At first it was like, okay, she's killing slavers, whatever. And then she's killing the Tarleys, and it's like, okay, I mean, yeah, they defied her, but they're like, that doesn't mean they're like horrible people. They were just, doing what they believed to be honorable. It wasn't as openly black and white as the slavers. In this case, you could have made it that, okay, now it's just civilians. How culpable can they really be? But still, as long as there's just a way that we can be sympathetic, at least a little bit, to her seeing them in some way emotionally culpable, we can buy why that threshold for her, that line of culpability with her enemies, keeps getting pushed further and further and further until it's anybody who even looks at her wrong is equivalent to a slaver.
Yeah, and I mean, what I was going to suggest, and the reason I brought up the season 7 flaws in the first place was, I think that you could have used Daenerys' eventual turn to madness as a way of evening out the sides back then.
A great point.
And then simultaneously foreshadowing it. Because obviously, because the way that you could do that is that Tyrion is giving very wise counsel that is true to his character, but then in some ways, both her greatest asset and her greatest flaw is her compassion for the dispossessed. I mean, we've seen with Ned Stark that kind of behavior is not very well rewarded in the show anyway. And we even see that in her storyline when in season 5, she has to make the hard decision to kill one of the people in Marine who was loyal to her, but he didn't follow the law. And it shows the messy nature of doling out justice according to your compassion for the dispossessed.
Right.
That really blurs the lines a little bit. So you could have had a gradual realization by Daenerys throughout season 7 that treating not only enemies with compassion, which she was never on board with, but that Tyrion would probably counsel, as he did with the Tarleys, but then compassion for civilians in general, she might slowly leave that by the wayside too, despite Tyrion's counsel, and have a slow slip into tyranny, as opposed to the sudden twist. And that would have made a lot more sense. And that also then would have weakened, that would have also had the effect of weakening Daenerys when she came to her castle Dragonstone and made the fight between Cersei and her more fair, because then the civilians are like, well, wait.
Right.
We have 2 tyrants here. What side am I going to take? And that might cause them then to openly defy Daenerys, and then that reinforces her narrative. Aha, see, the civilians, they're culpable. And then that twist to madness would have made way more sense.
Right. That's a great, yes, absolutely. That's a great point, dude.
And you wouldn't have had to betray Tyrion's intelligence in order to get that done.
Right.
I think you could have had it all.
Absolutely. That's a great point. So it's like we need to see like this philosophical change. And I feel like this is like a great so it's like what you need is like you need the philosophy of the character to change, and you need but it's like, but that's an internal thing. So then you need external situations. So like my writing teacher in college would always put it in these terms. He'd always say characters need to be faced with the pressure to make a decision, and then that pressure, they make a decision, the outcome of that decision then changes them, and that cycle repeats. So, she has this philosophy that she holds. She makes decisions, and she sees the outcomes of her decisions and realizes that for whatever reason, she no longer likes the results that philosophy is giving her. And that pushes her further and further in this direction. So you need these specific situations, these specific examples that are the specific small instances that push her further and further in a direction that move her core philosophy, which is internal, but we see that philosophy then being, acted out in external, visible action. And then it culminates in sort of the ultimate final instance.
Yes. And to put a button on that technique, there's actually a term for that, which T.S. Eliot coined. It's called the objective correlative. And essentially what it means is he used that phrase to critique Hamlet by Shakespeare, saying that all of Hamlet's psychological transformation was given through speech, and essentially we slowly see through his monologues and dialogues how he changes throughout the course of the play. And T.S. Eliot says that that's not good enough. There needs to be some sort of physical representation that embodies this psychological transformation. You could call it a symbol, like a physical symbol that represents his interchange. So like, to bring it back to Game of Thrones, the writers actually talked about this in season 2, because there's a scene where Theon Greyjoy has to decide whether or not he's going to tell Robb that Balon Greyjoy is going to send his Ironborn to the north to take it over, or is he going to be loyal to his father? And they could just have him say it. But what they do instead is they show him writing a letter to Robb Stark warning him, and then he looks at it and then he puts that scroll in the fire. So it puts in very physical, objective terms what was going on through his mind. He's like, first Rob is my brother, my spiritual brother, let's say. I'm gonna write him a note. But then he makes a decision, no, my family and my culture are more important, and that is symbolized by throwing that note in the fire. And that...
So an objective correlative is just like, it's just an external symbol that is long-term, that like you follow throughout the... So it's like a long-term instantiation of show, don't tell.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it can...
Right, it's like that you can track. It's a symbol that you can track throughout the change.
Yes.
Life of a character.
It doesn't necessarily have to be long-term, but if you can make it long-term, that ups its dramatic power by manyfold.
Sure. I mean, I feel like it's the long-term nature that makes it an objective correlative as opposed to just an instance of showing, not telling.
Sure.
Right? It's like what makes it an objective correlative is it's this. So what do those words mean? It's something that correlates with the progress of the character, but that is objective and visible as opposed to subjective and internal, and we can't see it.
Yes. So, I mean, I think one of the great examples of this in literature is Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Because, I mean, the premise of the story is that he stays young, but this portrait of him on the wall grows old and decrepit. And then not only does it show his physical transformation, but as he also becomes morally decrepit, and the portrait then shows the moral decrepitude seeping into his facial features. And I believe the story ends with him stabbing the picture, and then he dies too.
The costume designers for for Game of Thrones did this a little bit with Daenerys. I mean, this is not a good, because for it to be done on a writing level, there has to be interaction with it. But I don't know if you tracked this, but the colors she wore, I mean, this is a really common technique, changed over the course of the show. And if you look in the first few seasons, she wears the very first time we're introduced to her, she's in all white. She wears all white outfits a lot, and then she starts wearing darker and darker colors as she joins the Dothraki. She wears brown, and in the very last episode, she's wearing all black.
Yes, that's a very common thing in TV in particular. Yeah. Like Breaking Bad used this technique as well. When Skylar and Walter were at odds for a lot of the series, but as she started to get more on board with him, she started wearing white, meaning like I'm on Walter White's side.
Right. I mean, that's not an objective correlative really, because that's more just a symbol. What would make it an objective correlative is if we saw her intentionally choosing darker clothes for some specific reason that was related to her change in philosophy. Right? It would have to be a character decision or a writing thing, not just a costume choice.
Right. Yeah, like off the top of my head, a good example of an objective correlative is, say, we meet this little child character and he or she rides a little bike, like a little tricycle. And then as they become more introduced to what life is really like in the real world, the bicycle starts to get like more rusty, like the paint's up to it. And then like when they do something that shows that they've shed off the innocence of childhood, then the bike like goes off a cliff. I mean, obviously you'd have to weave that together dramatically well, but that's just off the top of my head.
Sure, but I mean, ideally they would take an active position in the outcome of why the bike is going through those stages. So it wouldn't just be that like it's a visual symbol. It would be that like I feel like maybe to try to improve upon that example you just gave, like perhaps they start out with the tricycle and then they trade in the tricycle intentionally for a two-wheel bike, because they want to be cool and fit in with the other kids. But that's not enough. Then they get older and they go to college and they trade in their bike for a motorcycle. And because that's going to be bigger and stronger and able to deal with the necessities of adult life better. And then finally in middle age, when they're going through a midlife crisis or something, they drive the motorcycle off a cliff or something. And it's like, but they've made choices that have like guided the change of this thing. It is a direct outcome of them changing.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So I mean, this technique is extraordinarily valuable for making abstract concepts really hit home emotionally, because at the end of the day, the reason why we love stories is because they have an emotional impact. So, I mean, one of the things I've found is that these techniques that we've been talking about, as far as objective correlatives, putting interesting characters in the same room, having the weaving of the characters form an immaculate tapestry, not betraying any of your characters or the theme of your show. What all that stuff does for me is it makes the emotional impact that much greater. And so all of those things are in service of this meta rule, which is don't be boring.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, but if you don't, I mean, obviously, if one of those things you're using, you're like, oh, it's going to be great, I'm using this technique, but it's to the detriment of your story, and it doesn't have an emotional impact, then just get rid of it.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
So moving on from these aspects that we've been talking about recently, one of the other things we should contrast is the world building at the beginning of the show, and then the lack thereof in the last few seasons of the show.
Yes,
and when I say the last few seasons of the show, my reference point is season 6, because that's the point when we were officially past the books.
Okay.
And so, going off on what George does well with world building, he is perfect at not only giving each character their own special and unique title and talent or skill, but then as far as the culture goes, he's great at proliferating his cultures with these, I don't know how else to say it except like encapsulatory nuggets. So what I mean by that is, like with the Lord of Light, what's the thing that they nail into your brain over and over again? The night is dark, is full of terrors, right?
Right.
And the same is true like at the Wall. Whenever they have a funeral for one of their fallen brothers, they say, and now his watch is ended. They don't say has ended. Now his watch is ended.
Right.
And
right.
There's something about the word choices of both of those phrases that, like, it's just a phrase, but it implies a whole other world that we're only seeing a fraction of. And each culture has, like, at least 3 of these things.
Yes, George he's maybe the best I've ever seen at that, what you're talking about. At filling his world with just these little delicious, tasty nuggets of poetry and interesting tidbits. It's just he's a genius at this. And it's the difference between, I mean, it's what makes a world pop. It's the difference between, and it's really what allows for him to have such a big world, right? I mean, everybody talks about how big the world of Game of Thrones is, right? And he's got like hundreds of characters and it's so much to keep track of. And the way that we're able to keep track of all that is that, again, like you said, each character is given, and what is it called? An eponym, a title, extra moniker. It's right. It's like, it's not just Sir Davos Seaworth. It's the Onion Knight. So it's like, it's a little nugget that helps us remember him. It's like, it's not just, Jaime Lannister. He's the Kingslayer.
Or it's not just Oberyn Martell, it's the Red Viper.
Right, they all have that thing. So it's like, you might not remember the character's name, but you always remember their little epithet, their little extra tidbit, and that helps you sort them. Not only does it help you keep track of everything, it's just tasty. You just like it. It's just fun. It's
and
cool.
It also avoids redundancy within characters, because one of the things about having such a large cast of characters is it would be very easy to just repeat yourself, which in real life, that is how it happens. There are a lot of people that, if you put them next to each other, their personalities would be very much the same. But in storytelling, your psychology likes it better when each character is their own unique world unto themselves. And so that's something that's really important when you have such a broad array of characters, is that they have something unique, whether it's the uniqueness of their particular combination of traits, or if they just have one trait that separates them from everybody else.
Right. Right, and that's of course, yes. I mean, yes, you're going to the deeper point, which is like it's not just titles and names and words and appearances. It's like these things are then reflected in deeper character traits and deeper quirks of everywhere it happens. When it's a cultural thing, when there's these little tidbits that identify and represent a culture. It's that it's not just on the surface level. The culture is also unique and interesting, and which is just reflected and summarized and encapsulated, as you said, in this little tidbit, this little phrase, this little piece of poetry, this cool little thing that sums it all up.
Yes.
And anyways, so like that's just a cool thing. I mean, I love this. I love great world building. I maybe love great worlding more than I love storytelling. Like it's so satisfying.
Do you think that's because of your background as a gamer?
Oh, for sure. That was part of my original love of video games. Is how video games are better than. And I'll say this right now. I'm gonna draw a line in the sand. Video games are the best artistic medium for world building, bar none. Because what's great about video games is that you can just be in the world. The inherent like difficulty sometimes that I have like this weird emotional reservation with stories sometimes where like stories have to change. And so the world has to change. And you never really get to just be in the world because you're always moving through it. You're both in space and time and plot. And so the world is changing, the characters are changing. And you get like and so sometimes I like to just be in a world, and video games excel at that like nothing else. You can just walk around Hyrule and just explore it and observe it, and it'll say the same for you as long as you want it to until you go on to the next plot point or whatever. But for now, it's like, and you can just listen to the music and absorb it and the beautiful colors, and it's like, I don't know. It's anyway, that's kind of a tangent, but
sure. And so to keep going on what George does well with world building, not only is the world more just interesting on its own merits, but then as the story progresses, these pockets of the world that we haven't seen before come to the fore. So for instance, the example in my head of this is obviously the main religion of Westeros is the seven-pointed star religion, and it's always mentioned tangentially, but we don't really understand a lot of the mythology behind that religion until season 5, when the High Sparrow comes in as a character. And so he's kept that
right.
He's kept that information that is explicit to everyone else in the world away from the viewer. And so then when it comes in season 5, it both feels good because it's new in that we don't know that much about it, but it's been established as a thing, so it doesn't feel like it just came out of nowhere. And he does that with many different parts of his world just because and that's one of the cool things about having a big world, is that you have a lot to choose from as far as what new things you want to explore. So as the seasons go on,
right,
you still feel like you're still learning. Even if you've seen the show from season 1 and you're like, okay, I think I've got a handle on this world, then season 5 comes along and this whole new thing comes your way, and it's very satisfying to watch.
Yeah, this is something that we've noticed for a long time. I think we've talked about this like a lot, where this is like a common attribute of a lot of the sort of prime eras of a lot of great stories, is that when they're at their best and at their height, they are in this exploratory mode, where a component of the plot is that we're getting more and more of the world revealed to us. One of the ones that we've talked about a lot is South Park. Like we both kind of are of the opinion that South Park has declined in quality in recent seasons, and I think one of the attributes of when it was at its prime was that we were constantly, like, the world of South Park was widening and broadening constantly. and that felt amazing. It was like new characters. Butters was an example, was a character that was created relatively recently, considering the life of the show. And then we would have whole episodes dedicated to exploring them and who they were. And then, Randy became it. Like, Randy was not an important character for a long time. Then all of a sudden he became this prominent, important character. We got to explore him and then his relationship with the other characters. And there was always, and so that gave it this feeling of, it just felt great because you got to, like, you weren't replacing the old stuff, you were just adding new stuff to it, and that gave you way more relationships to explore. And when you build out a world, it grows exponentially because you not only gain these new things, you also gain their relationships to all the old things. And now is when we're going to kind of get into the problem area. At some point, that often stops or slows down. It happened in South Park, where they switched modes from primarily exploratory and adding new things to sort of primarily referential, to where now they're mostly referencing things that have already happened and things we've already learned about. They're just kind of doing it again. And this is going to tie into our next thing we're going to talk about, which is Chekhov's gun. But we saw the same thing in Game of Thrones, right? Where it's like, at some point in the story, there's sort of, it turned over and it became less exploratory. We started seeing a lot less of the world, and it became more like we just seeing more and more and more of what we've already seen.
Right. If I had to summarize season 6 and really all of the seasons since season 6, I would summarize it as them saying, "Hey, remember when this one cool thing happened earlier? That was awesome, right?" So, like, for instance, in season 6, the only the only new thing that was really brought up was the King's Moot on the Iron Islands, because we didn't really know much about the culture of the Iron Islands, and it turns out they have something that resembles democratic elections. And that's something that I'm pretty sure is in the books. Not that particular election, but the idea that is an aspect of their culture. But besides that, in season 6, like they just kept recycling not only characters that we've seen before, but also plot points. So, like season 6 was trying to bring back all the characters who we hadn't seen for a while, like the Brotherhood Without Banners, Edmure Tully, Walder Frey, and there were many other examples of them just purely bringing characters back. I mean, it felt like they were just bringing them back just so that way we could know what has happened to them so far. It was all I always noticed in these last 3 seasons when we've been to a new castle that we've only heard about but never seen before. Like, there was an episode in season 7 where finally we got to see what Casterly Rock looked like, and also Highgarden. We had never actually been to those places, but we were only there for like a few moments. And it seemed like that would have been
right.
Like, I would have loved to have explored what it's like to live at either of those places, but they were just in passing, which was a bummer to me watching it.
Right, exactly. And so I think like this, like there's sort of an inherent difficulty here because my first sort of reaction when to this realization is, okay, that makes perfect sense, but isn't this an inherent problem in storytelling? Isn't there necessarily some point in the story where we can't just keep learning new things about the world? We can't just keep exploring the world up into the very last minute. There has to be some point at which, okay, now we've seen the majority of the world, and it's more going to be about doing things in what we've already seen, areas and places and people we've already seen. We can't just constantly be adding new places and new characters forever. That would be unsustainable. And then, so it's like, what is the solution there?
Sure.
To that problem? But I think the answer is something to the effect of exploring what we've already seen to its end. So giving us the final, for lack of a better word, answer to each of the questions that has been raised by each of the world elements we've been introduced to.
Yes. Yeah, there needs to be a certain moment where you feel, if full isn't the right word, then satisfied is the right word. Because
right.
If you tune into a story, it just seems self-evident that you want to leave it knowing that every single drop of juice that was in this metaphorical apple has been extracted to its highest amount possible.
Right.
And just because you can spend too long on certain subjects, which I felt the High Sparrow arc and the Hall of Faces arc fell prey to that trap, which is that they were spent too long. But then, like, as far as seeing Casterly Rock and Highgarden, those were only in there for a few moments in one episode. So there wasn't enough of that.
Like the most obvious way that this works, or almost place that this works, is in mysteries. A lot of times, a component of storytelling and world building is mysteries that are intrinsic to various elements of the world, right? And you know, in the context of Game of Thrones, these would be who is Melisandre, the Red Priestess, and what is the nature of her powers and her relationship with like the Lord of Light. Like what is up with that? Why is he the only one of these gods that seems to actually be able to manifest magic in the world? What is the nature of Bran's powers, etc. Now, none of these questions were really ever answered, but a lot of the times I feel like these mysteries that have gone on for a long time, even though it's not something new, like we've been living with this mystery for a long time, it can be the second half. If the first half of your story is supposed to be about introducing elements and exploring the world, the second half should be about closing the loops of those, and that would be part of that would be like revealing the answers to mysteries, right? It's like what?
Sure. Yeah,
and then bringing things together, like bringing elements together. Would be the other way.
There's a good rule that sort of summarizes this, both as far as world building and character. But I got this one from Brandon Sanderson, who's a famous fantasy author, and he came up with these. He codified these laws of magic because his whole point was, if you don't understand how magic works, then every time it's used, it's going to feel like a Deus Ex Machina, which is very unsatisfying. And his third law is expand on what you already have before you add something new. And I feel that applies to world building 100% as well, because you want each part of the world to feel endless, like all cultures do. And I mean, obviously you can't do that because you're just one person coming up with a story, but you can do what George does and come up with these things that imply a bigger world, even if he didn't build the whole thing. Like those little sayings that we were talking about earlier. And now his watch is ended, etc.
Yeah, totally. Now, I have to admit to not having read the books, so I don't know, but obviously they're not complete. So I don't know if George's intention was to reveal some of these mysteries. But I think a really satisfying use of these last few, one thing that for me would have made these last few seasons a lot better would have been to reveal the answers to some of these. I mean, it doesn't have to be all of them, and I think his perspective on this, I'm guessing, I'm speculating a little bit here, is that he probably feels that it's a bit cheesy to just reveal everything about your world, how everything works, why everything is the way it is, and that in life we don't get all the answers. But I think you can, and I think that's true a little bit. Like if you completely unravel the rainbow of every component of your world, of everything, if there's no mystery left at all, that will probably suck a little bit of the magic out of your world.
Yes.
But I think I think there's probably a happy medium, right? Like you can do some of the bigger ones and leave some of the lesser ones intact, and that'll give us a satisfying middle ground.
Right. Like as far as...
So had they answered some of those questions, that would have been a really big step for me.
Well, specifically, one of the things that I'm unsatisfied with being unanswered is the nature of the Lord of Light. Because obviously there are many religions in the world, but one of them is exponentially more true. Because look, if your God can accurately predict the future and bring people back to life, then your God is correct.
Right.
And so one of the questions I have is, why was Melisandre wrong about Stannis?
Right. Right.
Shouldn't there be some reason why this god who has been correct about everything else was wrong about Stannis? Did she misinterpret it? And if so, how did she misinterpret it? Because obviously the point that it was leading to was that Arya Stark is the hero that's chosen, essentially. She's the one that killed the Night King. And like Beric Dondarrion's kept coming back to life, so that way he could give his life so Arya could live. So that seems pretty clear to me. And then with Jon Snow, it's like, oh, he came back to life because he had to kill Daenerys. So maybe, I mean, it's possible he's the hero that was chosen, and that the thing that the Lord of Light was talking about was not the White Walkers, but Daenerys Targaryen, becoming the ultimate tyrant. But then, if those are the right answers, then why was Melisandre wrong for so long? I feel like that's something that should have been answered, and been answered very clearly. Because that needed an answer.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely. And, we'll see what George does with the books, but, yeah, the fact that they didn't answer those is definitely one of the problems I had with the show. One sort of subtle thing that I think was kind of interesting was there are two primary sources of magic in the world, right? Bran and the Lord of Light, right? Or am I missing any other big ones?
Well, arguably the dragons, because something that this is made 100% clear, but it is noticeable. The fact that the dragons are back in the world were the things that made all the other magic possible. So like in season 1, there was almost no magic, but then at the end of season 1, the dragons hatched. And then magic started slowly but surely to come back into the world and started getting more and more esoteric as the show went on.
That's interesting. Okay. So let's take a few shots. What could be a potential rewrite here? What could be some ways some reveals that could have happened regarding these things that would have felt satisfying?
Well, first of all, I'm thinking about what you said about the Lord of Light promising the Iron Throne to people, and I'm not sure if that was his promise. I'm pretty sure it was just to...
Okay.
It's like the prince that was promised to save the world from... It's not clear. From what? From
Darkness.
Either the White Walkers
Okay, right.
or Daenerys' tyranny. That's not clear.
Sure.
And that's something I'm fine with not being clear. Because the whole point of prophecy, if you do it correctly, is that it's supposed to... Like, people are supposed to put their wish fulfillment onto the prophecy and then act it out. Like, that's good use of prophecy to me. So as far as fixing it, one of the things that would have fixed it is what we talked about with Melisandre. Why was she wrong about Stannis? Like, what did she misidentify? Because she saw a battle in the snow, and there have been many battles in the snow. So it's possible that she just misread. Maybe the snow was too blurry. I don't know. I mean, the problem is I'm left to speculate because they didn't give an answer. And so it goes back to the thing we were talking about earlier where it's like, it seems weird to me that that's just a whoops. Like,
right.
If it's a whoops, then there should be something about her
right.
that made her make this mistake.
Like, we needed to have seen her process of trying to interpret the Lord of Light's messages and act them out. So, like, we need to have seen her receive this message in some way or whatever, that she needs to support the prince who is promised, but she doesn't know who the prince who is promised was, and she's left to try to figure out who it was and make a decision. But we can see how that interpretation could possibly have been wrong. Ideally, she makes that misinterpretation because of some character trait of hers, that she is, whatever. And then, so like, if it, let's just dummy version, if she was, let's just say, there was images in the fire, because that seems to be, one of the ways that he seems to communicate with people. So she sees an image in fire, and we are shown this image too, but it's low resolution, it's blurry, it's hard to tell. It's a battle in the snow, It's somebody who's vague, a shadowy figure who kind of vaguely looks like Stannis. And then we see her trying to match people to that shadowy figure. Like, who was that? Was it Stannis? And then we see the moment that makes her think it was Stannis. But then, later on, after she is shown to have been wrong, we see that a different moment and a different person who is very clearly, or maybe you could it varies on how subtle you could be with this if you wanted to. But the situation that was before unclear, whatever this was, this image of a person, shadowy figure standing in a doorway or whatever it is now we are seeing that with, like, now Jon Snow is a shadowy figure standing in a doorway, and all of a sudden it clicks and you're like, oh my god, this is the image we were seeing in the flames before, and now that I'm seeing it actually happen, it's clear. And until I saw it, it was unclear because it was open to interpretation. But now that I'm seeing it, it's like, oh my god, I can see how that could have been misinterpreted before, but now I'm sure this is right. Right? Like that would have been a way, maybe.
Yeah. And I mean, the other thing is that we didn't get any sense of this journey within Melisandre because she was very dehumanized throughout most of the series. She was just this kind of archetypal Rasputin demon whisperer figure.
Right.
She didn't seem like she had any doubts or any...
That's a good point.
Anything like that throughout the show. And then it's like all of a sudden she's wrong and now she has doubts. It felt like it betrayed her character. So I felt like we should have had to see that earlier. And then it could have cashed in on it later. This is all leading up to what this last part of the podcast is, which is Chekhov's gun, by the way.
Okay, so let's just get into Chekhov's gun now, because it feels like we're leaning toward that. We want to get into that.
So Anton Chekhov, he was a famous playwright, end of the 19th century, early 20th century, and he had a famous saying, which was essentially, if you hang a gun on the wall in Act 1, you better be prepared to use it in Act 3, otherwise it shouldn't be on the wall in Act 1. And the point of that is that don't set things up early unless you're planning on having them pay off later. And
vice versa. If things happen later, they need to have been set up earlier.
Exactly. Which, I mean, that's how good twists happen. Because, like, you can't just do a thing. Whenever you just do a thing without setting it up, but it's surprising, people think that that's a good writing because it's like, oh, you didn't see that coming. That's a good twist. But it's one of those things that makes you feel spiritually sick to your stomach when you see it a little bit. You know something's wrong, but it's hard to articulate what's wrong with it.
Right.
But that's what's wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And the more common, name for this is setup and callback. And I feel like this Chekhov's gun, the principle of setup and callback, it's like 75% of plotting, if not writing in general. Like it is the majority of, I don't know, maybe that's an exaggeration. It's a huge component of the craft of storytelling. And like it's all about trying to create setups and then their callbacks in such a way that those callbacks feel inevitable yet unpredictable, right? Which is sort of paradoxical at face value, like intentionally. So it's trying to toe that narrow line that is the difficult part in the craft and the whole thing that makes it work, or etc.
Right. And in fact, I don't know if this experiment has ever been done, but I'd be willing to bet that if you took a bunch of people who knew nothing about writing and you gave them a movie script that they had in front of them while they were watching a movie or a play or whatever, and you told them to, quote, circle the cool parts, unquote, those are the types of moments they would circle.
Right.
Which is the coming together of various plot threads that seemed unrelated, but that all of a sudden collapse in a single instance. And they've been set up with little clues in the beginning. So the author has been slowly priming you for this moment.
So to get into the show, like, this is part of what we've talked about. I mean, Erik and I have talked about the show like so much, and one of the things that we always come back to about the genius of George R. R. Martin is his ability to weave setup and callback, and especially evident in the first few seasons, so beautifully and elegantly. And like when it's at its best, what's happening is he's planting all of these things, and then they're coming to fruition. And as they come to fruition, when it's at its best, multiple threads are coming together, coming to fruition, paying off at once. So there'll be one event in which multiple threads with involving multiple characters pay off simultaneously. And at its peak, a reveal is also happening. So if you can get all of that happening at once, it's this like singular moment where there's this, all of these things that have been circling each other, this like double, triple, quadruple helix of plot and character suddenly collapse into one, as you said, I love that word, collapse. They collapse into a singular moment or series of moments event, which then pays them off, moves them forward, ideally in an unexpected way, and also something is revealed, and that's what's like those fucking sublime moments.
Right, and to give season 6 credit, one of the great moments of that season was the revelation about Hodor, and that is a moment that George told them about. So David Benioff and DBY say in their after the episode segment, and that does all those things, because we've known the whole time his name has been Hodor. I never even had in my mind the question, why Hodor?
Right.
But then it's like he answered it, and it revealed the extent of Bran's powers, which has been this thing that's been, like, we waited for 4 seasons to find out what the hell this three-eyed raven thing was. And finally in season 6 we learn that it's a warg technique that can be used to view the past. But then with this Hodor moment, we find out that he can affect the past through these things in a way that has real consequences for things that happened like way before he was even born.
Right, exactly. That's a moment of like Hodor's plot, like his thread gets concluded and paid off. Bran's thread gets concluded and paid off. Of course, along with, to a lesser extent, the characters Bran is traveling with. All of them are coming together in this one moment. And there's so many examples of that throughout the first several seasons of the show.
I'm thinking of in season 4 when Shay came back to the trial to testify against Tyrion.
Sure.
Because I love watching the show with my mom, because she's like the ultimate, like she just says out loud the archetypal thing that you're supposed to think when you're watching the show. So like for the first 2 seasons of the show, when you know Shay, you're supposed to be wondering whether or not she's sincerely in love with Tyrion, or she's just faking it because she's a whore and she's greedy and wants his association with the Lannister and to have money, all that stuff.
Right.
But then that's settled at the end of season 2, when Tyrion has fallen from grace and even has an ugly scar on his face, and she still decides to stay with him and says, I am yours and you are mine. And like, honestly, I cried during that moment. That was beautiful. And then season 3, she stays with him even though he's in peril. And then she was going to stay with him even through the peril that he was going to face in season 4. But Tyrion knows that Cersei is going to try to kill her. And so he has to be cruel to her and try to send her away. But then, like, in the trial moment, so first you think that story is over. You think, okay, there's the parentheses at the end of that story. She's going to go to Pentos or Bravos or wherever she's going. That's the end. And then in the trial, there's this other thread going on, because it's like, well, obviously the trial is going to be rigged. But then we learn what Tywin wanted all along by having Jaime swear to leave the Kingsguard and become the heir to the heir to Casterly Rock. And that was Tywin's, like, he's been working this long form plan, because he never shuts up about his legacy. And finally we see the fruition of that plan. If Tywin lets Tyrion go to the Wall, then Jaime will fulfill his duties to his family. And you're like, and you see that and you're like, okay. It seems like that story's gonna end now, because that feels like the fulfillment of that story. There's the bracket. Then Shay comes in. And so it's like, oh, what story that you thought had a bracket at the end, there did not. Now that's continuing on. And then this other story that you thought had a bracket at the end did not have a bracket. And then Tyrion ends the episode with that whammy, I want a trial by combat, which has not been mentioned since season 1. And so it's like all three of those things converge at that one moment. And like I remember, like I walked away from that episode in an ecstasy, where it's just like God, this is the greatest fucking thing that I've ever seen.
Right. Yeah, that's a great example. That's a great example. So many things came together there.
And it wouldn't have felt good if he hadn't used Chekhov's gun and did all that work to set up all that stuff in the beginning.
Right. And then of course Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, ends up being Tyrion's champion. And then he has a whole plot line where he's trying to seek vengeance for the death of the murder of his sister. So that's a whole plot line that is then culminated in the trial by combat. There's that's a great example. I mean, another classic example, not to do too many, but the other one that first came to my mind was the Red Wedding, where
absolutely.
Right. I mean, that's like sort of the classic example where like the decisions Rob has made, like his one fatal flaw was that he was too romantic and he fell in love with this girl and violated his promise with the phrase. And of course, that gave Walter Frey a reason to, betray him. But of course, there was also Catelyn Stark, who was also involved in that whole thing. And she had betrayed Robb by releasing Jaime. And so
right. So then they had to find new allies because the Karstarks never forgave Catelyn for that.
Right.
So then they killed the Lannister prisoners and Robb had to decapitate him. So they lost a huge part of their army. And that's the thing that had to lead them to ask the phrase in the first place.
For the first place, right. And so it was like, and it was a reason why that she was, right. And so it's like, there was like all these threads that had come together all in this one climactic moment that led to her downfall and Robb's downfall. And of course, several other characters associated with the Starks.
Yeah, I mean, and it's all a result of setting things up and calling them back, putting the gun on the wall in Act 1, and then using it in Act 3.
So there are ways that you can fall down, right? There are ways that you can fail to use this principle properly. There are two ways. It's kind of, I almost think about like a type 1 and type 2 error. It's kind of the equivalent of like a false positive and a false negative. The lesser mistake you can make of the two, in my opinion, and you can disagree with me if you want, is not using all of the things that you have set up. So, right, like you set some things up, and Erik, you have a name for this, Erik. You call this not using all the parts of the buffalo.
Yes.
Right, so you want to explain that metaphor?
Sure. I mean, obviously in indigenous cultures, especially in America where they had buffalo, they didn't want to be wasteful, so they used every single part of it. And so you want to use Chekhov's gun in storytelling to the point where there's almost nothing that you've set up that you have not paid off at some point.
Right.
And you should probably have a reason why you didn't pay off those other things. Otherwise, they're just sitting there just to distract you, to make you think that there's meaning there, but then there isn't. And once again, unless that's the point of your book, unless you're writing The Great Gatsby, where the whole point of that book is people find in random events meaningful symbolism, don't do that. You have to pay off things that you set up.
Right. But the far more egregious mistake is to do the opposite, is to not set things up that you are now essentially calling back. It's not a callback, of course, but doing things late in the game, late in the story that were never set up.
And that's the mistake that most people make when they try to write a twist.
Right. And that is the primary. And of course, there's other ways that you could make lesser mistakes, those are the two big categories. The other smaller would be like doing setups and callbacks, but in ways that are really obvious and predictable. So that would be but those are the two big categories. And the latter one that we just talked about, doing things without having set them up, I think is one of the big categories of mistake that they made in these last seasons.
Especially when it comes to Daenerys going mad.
Right.
It's like they thought they had set it up, but they didn't set it up in a compelling way at all.
Right.
In fact, I remember when we were in college and we knew that writing professor Mia, and she said that one of the biggest annoyances with a lot of young people's scripts is that they think that a twist is storytelling, and they would laboriously torture the plot so that way they can try to get this twist to work. Whereas I'm of the opinion that even if I see something coming, but it's awesome, I don't care if I predicted it.
Agreed.
It's still awesome. Whereas if you take the Lost, like the TV show Lost approach, and instead go like, the ending, didn't see that coming. It's like, yeah, I didn't see it coming because you didn't set it up at all and it sucked. Like,
right.
That's even worse. That's even worse. I mean, that's way worse than writing a plot that's predictable.
Absolutely. Yeah, I just think that they were doing that like all the time in the last few seasons. I mean, obviously the big one is Daenerys, but I mean, it was constant.
Well, one that comes to mind is when Jaime Lannister was knocked into the water, and then it looked like he died, but then the next episode, Bronn saved him. It felt like there was a hero shield, and it's like betraying the promise of the show, because one of the things that's exciting about the show is that there's no hero shield. And for those who don't know what I mean,
plot armor.
The hero shield, yeah, plot armor. It's essentially, it's like, well, there are 5 main characters at this place, and none of them, and the plot needs them to exist, so therefore nothing's going to happen to them. Whereas this show was more than willing to kill people at the beginnings of their journeys, even, like Renly Baratheon, where it seemed like he had a big role to play, and then it just cut his journey off at the knees. And the show reveled in that. Whereas in these last 3 seasons, it felt like a lot of characters had hero armor.
Yeah.
Hero shield.
For sure. I think probably all you would need to do to fix that one is just it probably wouldn't need a super long-term setup. All it probably would have needed was to show Bronn like seeing Jaime in peril and not wanting to, like, because Jaime is his money. If he loses Jaime, he doesn't get paid, and that's what motivates Bronn.
Right. I mean, and the thing that made it misleading was the last shot of that episode where it showed Jaime sinking into the abyss, because, I mean, the point was supposed to be that his armor was so heavy that it was dragging him down. And if you just cut that shot that made it seem like, oh, his armor was too heavy, and then to make it seem like Bronn saving him was an ex machina,
right,
that would have fixed, like, that was a very small fix. Whereas the Daenerys going mad one, as we've talked about fixes for that one, that needed a lot of massaging to get it right.
Yes. Certainly one of them for me was Bran taking the throne.
Sure.
I mean, what the fuck was that? That was out of nowhere. Certainly we were expecting something climactic with Bran. We were expecting some use to be made of his powers, which up until that moment, even really including that moment, they committed the error of setting up setups with no callbacks way more often than they committed the opposite error.
Yeah, like with Bran and the Hodor thing, that was a huge revelation, and that begs the question, what else did he try to do? How else has he affected the timeline?
Right.
So one of the other things about the last 3 seasons that didn't feel quite right as far as storytelling goes was they almost abused Chekhov's gun, which is that they brought stuff back, but it wasn't adding anything. So I talked about that with world building, but then the same is true for just story beats. So we talked about Daenerys coming out of the flames in season 6 again. We talked about the repetition of the King of the North thing that was at the end of season 6, meant to call back season 1. But then there was just a bunch of like requoting of lines. Like I remember in season 8, Tyrion and Jaime were talking to each other, and they re-brought up that line where Tyrion had said in season 1 when he was asked, how would you like to die? He said, at the ripe old age of 80 with a glass of wine in my hand and some woman's lips around my cock, or something like that. And it just seemed like they brought it back in season 8 gratuitously, just so that way they could have a callback. And there were plenty of moments like that. in the last few seasons.
Right, and it's like it's the opposite of like just doing it just to do it again. Like the whole point of a setup and callback is you're not just doing a thing and then doing it again. The point is that you're planting a seed and then that seed grows into a tree. It's different. It evolves into something. We're not just repeating things.
Right. And you can contrast those types of callbacks with the Tyrion trial request for a trial by combat. That one was one that was used well, the request for a trial by combat. But then these other ones, they're not adding anything. And we talked about the reason why the trial by combat one was good was because it was a convergence of many different threads. Whereas the other ones just felt like, we need to fill out some blank space here. And we don't have any source material. So let's just do this old thing that makes it feel like, oh yeah, it's still in the world because we're referencing this thing that happened.
Right.
So the way I like to think of it, tying it back to Chekhov's gun, is the thing that the show was a master at was it simultaneously gave storylines room to breathe so that way they could take you could get the most juice out of a storyline. But then each episode would have a payoff that was set up by Chekhov's gun, so that way you could leave for that week feeling satisfied while still being excited for the next one. The metaphor that I like to use is it's like a series of wheels lined up next to each other that are all going at different speeds, and there's a certain like design on each of the wheels that is the same across all the wheels. And that design, whether it be like a red slab or something like that, because the wheels are spinning at different speeds, the red slab of each wheel is on top at a different time than all the other ones. So it's like on this wheel, the red wedge is on top. It's like, oh, that story's going to pay off. But on the other wheels, the red wedge is like, oh, it's down underneath. It's not even close to being paid off. Or it's like, oh, this one's coming up on the horizon. It's going to pay off in 1 or 2 episodes.
Right. That's a great metaphor because it explains so much. Because like what you want then is a mix of the wheels being staggered and asynchronized, but then occasionally falling into sync.
Yeah, it's like the blinker metaphor. When your blinker lines up with the car in front of you.
Right. So like usually you want them to be staggered. If they're in perfect lockstep all the time, it's boring and predictable. You always know when they're all about to be up at the top, and it's like, well. So what you want is that there always to be one at the top, but you're never really sure which one it's going to be. But then sometimes, all of a sudden, they all come at the top, and it's a huge payoff, and a bunch of them click together. Or not all, but a lot of them, and that's like a huge, big moment.
Right. And one of the things that one of the things the later seasons suffer from is all the wheels were synced up, where like the first many episodes were all transition material, but then they'd make like episodes 9 and 10 have all the plot points that would line up. And what that meant was that some stories got too little time and other stories got too much time. So like in season 6, Cersei, in my opinion, should have blown up the Sept of Baelor like at least 3, if not 4 episodes earlier. Because that storyline was taking way too much time. Whereas it felt like the leaving of Meereen at the end of season 6 flew by. Because the whole point of that season was Tyrion was supposed to show his abilities to govern a city. Everything that he's learned, he can use now to govern the city. And then the last few episodes of the season is like, whoops, it didn't work out, and Daenerys is back, and we killed everyone, now we're going to Westeros.
Right.
And all of that happened in like 3 episodes or so. That didn't have enough time to breathe. So...
yeah, we haven't even talked about pacing really at this, which was another whole big problem with the last few seasons.
Right. But it goes back to that wheel metaphor where it felt like all the wheels were spinning at the same time, but the wheels are of different sizes. And so Like some of the wheels, like they just didn't need to turn as many times, whereas some of them they need to be turned more.
Right. I know you have some theories, and you also read some theories online as to how they could potentially have done some reveals and conclusions of various world elements that may have been cool or
Sure.
satisfying. What like give me some
So
examples.
with one of the most unsatisfying arcs, arguably, was of Bran Stark. Because for the last few seasons, he's been this kind of Dr. Manhattan, all seeing, all knowing, godlike figure.
Right.
And A, that personality type is just boring. But then B, he wasn't used effectively for anything. Like, if he can see everything that did happen and that will happen, I mean, maybe I'm not understanding. Maybe he doesn't know the future. But wouldn't his abilities have served them well many times throughout the series? And so, one of the best theories I hear about how his abilities could have been used, and this is not his abilities being used well. This is like the Hodor thing to sort of bring that storyline, to put a parenthesis at the end of that storyline. One of the theories that I read online was that either during the battle with the White Walkers, or now that we know that Daenerys has gone mad, and that maybe George R. R. Martin is planning on doing that, during one of those two battles, Bran decides, I better go back in time and try to prevent all of this from happening. And the moment he chooses is to go back to the Mad King Aerys. But if you've ever seen the history and lore videos of Game of Thrones that are on YouTube, you'll know that the Mad King wasn't always mad. At the beginning of his reign, he was just normal, and then due to mysterious circumstances, he went mad. I mean, people think it's because of the incestuous nature of his dynasty, I don't know why I just said dynasty. So Bran goes back to that moment, but then the phrase, instead of hold the door, that's being uttered in the modern time is burn them all. And that could refer to the dragons burning the White Walkers, or maybe Daenerys is shouting it as she burns down King's Landing. And then when Bran goes back, that phrase is what enters the Mad King's head, because as we know, that's the phrase that he kept saying when he insisted on placing wildfire throughout the city and burning everything to the ground. And so that would have brought Bran's arc to a close, where it's like, now he's affected the past twice, but the Hodor thing, as big of a revelation as that was small beans compared to the fact that Bran affected this entire war, essentially. And so that would have been an amazing, like, whammy ending. And I must emphasize, this was not my theory. This has been expounded upon by fans of the books and the show for years. But as soon as I read that, I went, like, I don't care if I predicted that would happen or that other people predicted. If that happened, no matter what, it's going to be awesome.
Right, exactly. And that would have been a perfect example of all the things we've been talking about. That would have been a callback to Bran's powers, a satisfying plot resolution, in the sense that he did something. I mean, he didn't do it. He was an example of a setup with no callback. The whole Hodor thing served as a setup for what? Like, it felt like that should have gone somewhere. We should have, now that we see what his powers can do, we should see them used. And that never happened, so that would have been satisfying in that level. It would have been a reveal in the sense that we learned some more deep things about why the Mad King went mad, we learned more things about what Bran's powers are capable of, what he's capable of. It would have, all these things would have been tied together. And yeah, that would have been awesome. Like, I agree completely that should have been. I would not be surprised if that were canon and George does end up doing that, and they just didn't do it because he didn't tell them about it or something. Or he was going to do it and then decided against it because the people guessed it.
Right. So, yeah, a lot of the sins that the last few seasons of Game of Thrones has committed can be attributed to misuses of Chekhov's gun, both in terms of plot and character, but also in terms of world building.
Right. So.
And on the converse, Chekhov's gun can also fix those problems, in our belief, as we've tried to fix these problems while we've been talking to each other, right?
We've covered a lot here. I mean, this has been by no means comprehensive, but I think we've got into a lot of what we feel worked at the beginning and didn't work at the end.
Sure. I mean, this show has kind of left a huge rift in the culture as far as what people wanted from how it would end and how it did end. And the problem is now the problem for us is obviously it kind of messed us up spiritually a little bit. But then for the writers, like, now they're going to be greeted with every new project that they do with hatred from the fans. They've messed up their own careers and really not giving this ending what it needed.
Yeah, it's really sad. It's such a common syndrome among TV shows that their last season is extremely unsatisfying. And for oftentimes many of the same reasons that we've discussed here. It's a shame.
Yeah, people I'll end my commentary, I think, by saying, just to bring this back, anyone who says messing up a story isn't a big deal is just wrong. Storytelling is it's one of the few things that are purely human. Because, like, animals can use tools and build stuff. They might not be able to build as cool of stuff as we are, and they might not be able to understand the world as well as we can due to science and mathematics. But they have the capacity to be able to do that stuff. Whereas, like, I can't imagine a snail recounting the great lizard conquering of years ago, like, and telling this epic to, like, their posterity so that way it may live on. I mean, let me be clear, I know nothing about evolution or animals or anything like that. But it's such a purely human impulse, as far as I can tell. And there's really nothing that cuts as deep. I mean, ironically, as much as I didn't like the ending, Tyrion said as much in the last episode. He said there's nothing as powerful as a good story, and he's right, but the shame of it is that he's in a story that fucked up its ending. What irony. And so I don't want to treat any of this stuff lightly. It's really important to me that this stuff gets done right. And if I live my life correctly, I'll put more storytelling satisfaction into the world than dissatisfaction. Because, I mean, obviously there's only so much of it that you can control. But I think understanding these techniques is a good way of orienting yourself properly down that road.
Agreed. All right. Well, I think that's going to conclude episode number 1.
All right.
Thanks for tuning in, anybody who did, and for those of you who didn't, go jump onto a red hot spike.
Just one, though, because we want to just punish you a little bit. Come back. Even if you didn't. I mean, I don't know how you could come back if you didn't listen. All right. That was episode 1 of Storytelling Deconstructed. We'll see you next time.